We live in a time when in virtually every way imaginable, the church is losing its influence in the world. Churches are closing at record numbers. Attendance is down. We're losing people on both ends of the spectrum. And in the midst of all of that, there's this growing number of nuns. What I'm talking about are the people who answer the question, none, to their religious affiliation. As a matter of fact, the number is 23%, and that number has been growing over the last 20 years in steady progression. So much so that today the nuns represent the exact same number as the other top two groups. So the other top two groups are evangelicals and Catholics, both representing 23% of the people who answered that question. So just think about that for a second. The astounding statement that makes about the church and who we are. There's much to be concerned about with the church and its influence in our culture today. But I'd rather focus this morning just a little bit on some positive news. Not some kind of Pollyanna idea, but looking into some of the realities that the church has in terms of the opportunities before them. Let me quote from a Barna report. In 2014, the Barna Group published a report entitled "The State of Pastors Leading in Complexity." And it stated that people seem to trust pastors when it comes to overtly spiritual topics, but are less confident in their counsel on more day-to-day practical kinds of things, close to the ground kinds of things. They found that only 1 in 5 U.S. adults holds a positive opinion of pastors, and with an equal number who say pastors hold little or no influence in their community. And then a year later, they published another report entitled "The Good News About Global Poverty." And in that report, the numbers flipped. And here's what they ended up saying. They ended up saying that the trust that the American public places in pastors' opinion of poverty presents an increasingly rare public platform for ministers. Previous research has shown that there is a kind of cultural credibility crisis for pastors. And then they said, yet pastors have incredible potential to lead the charge and position the U.S. church as a powerful force in anti-poverty endeavors. Now just think about that for a second. Losing credibility in virtually every category. 2 reports come out, one saying that pastors and churches by extension have little or no influence in our culture at all. 1 year later, when they put out a report on global poverty, they find that the public, the general public, is desperately looking to the church, desperately looking to pastors for answers. Folks, that seems to me to be an opportunity if the church is willing to step into it. In other words, the church is still looking to the world is still looking to the church for answers when it comes to helping the poor. And if the church is willing to step up to that challenge, that's good news for churches, for pastors, and I would say for the poor. But that challenge is requiring us to rethink what we've done through traditional forms of charity. And I think one of the best ways to describe that rethinking and what might flow out of it is how Poverty Cure talks about it. And when they say that we have turned the poor into objects of our charity and compassion instead of seeing them as the subjects and the protagonists in their own story. When we understand the dignity of the human person, no matter how much material poverty they wrestle with, when we understand that they are endowed with creative capacity and made in the image of God, it changes absolutely everything about the way we understand things like charity, missions, development, and the poor. That's the kind of rethinking that the church and secular philanthropy is wrestling with today. And I would say that if we rightly understand it, that kind of thinking goes way back into ancient Hebrew thinking about people, economies, the poor, and things like that. And so this morning, for just a few minutes, I'd like to focus on the book of Ruth and what the book of Ruth can teach us about this kind of rethinking, and delve into just a little bit the ideas that were inherent in Hebrew thinking about this concept of charity. Now, we all know the story of Ruth, that Elimelech takes his wife Naomi and his 2 sons over to Moab, and that was an unthinkable thing because the Moabites were the despised people of the Israelites and vice versa, but there was a famine in the land, and so what does a man do? He takes his family over to Moab, thinking that we'll figure this out somewhere along the way. And then tragedy of tragedy, Elimelech dies. But that's okay because Naomi still has 2 sons, and they'll take care of her. They marry, and they can't find any good Jewish girls in Moab, so they marry a couple of Moabites. And all along what they're doing is they are painting themselves into a corner in terms of who and where they might belong. Because they don't belong to the Moabites, and now because of their intertanglement with the Moabites, they're not going to belong to the Israelites as well. But again, Naomi's okay because she has 2 sons. And then we know the story. Her 2 sons die. And now it's left with a Jewish woman in a foreign land and 2 foreign wives who are off limits because they married a Jewish man. And so what does Naomi do? She does what any, I suspect, self-respecting woman would do, and she says to both of her daughter-in-laws, go back. You have a better chance of making it with your own people than you do because I'm going back to Israel. And Orpah says, okay, I'm going to take my chances back here in Moab. But we know the story in which Ruth says, no, I won't go back. And we read that and we know that wonderful passage in the 3rd chapter where Ruth says, don't tell me to go back, that I'm going to stay with you and that your people will become my people, and where you go, I will go, and where you die, I will die. And in that moment, Naomi experiences what the Jewish people call chesed. In the Jewish thinking, the word charity came in 2 different words. And it's hard in English to nail it down to precise kinds of things. But we can come close, and we can certainly come close enough in the context in which we live today to give some meaning to these ideas. So the idea of chesed was that it was an act of kindness, and that you could do an act of kindness to anybody, that when my children do nice things to me, it's called chesed. That when you do nice things to somebody else, random acts of kindness is an example of chesed. It didn't have to happen just to the poor. As a matter of fact, oftentimes it didn't happen to the poor. But it was considered charity, loving kindness. But they also had another word. They had another word that was Sadaqa. And the beautifulness of the nuance of Hebrew understanding of charity was that there were different kinds of charity. And that Sadaqa had 3 basic components. It was always directed towards the poor, that it was always seen as an act of justice, and it was always concerned about protecting people's dignity. And so you know what happens in this story, that Ruth goes back to Boaz is a relative of Naomi, and Ruth goes back to Boaz's field, and in the field, the poor can come and glean. And gleaning was an act of tzedakah. It was seen as an act of justice, that even if I owned that field, for me to harvest all the way to the edges of my field was an act of injustice. Now think about it. You see how that's embedded in their idea. But what also did it do? The idea of gleaning allowed the poor to retain their dignity even as they were doing, because they were doing these kinds of things. Sadaqa is always aimed at the poor. It always maintains a person's dignity. And it's always an act of justice. The best way that I can think, or in recent years, of the difference between chesed and tzedakah was summed up by Rick Roussel last year when he came and spoke to us. Rick is the pastor in Longmont, Colorado. wrote the book, The Externally Focused Church, about 20 years ago. And when I was talking to Rick about coming here for this event, we were reflecting on that book. And he said, Tom, when I wrote that book 20 years ago, it was all about acts of kindness. And he said, the last 20 years has been a journey from doing good things to solving real problems. And I said, Rick, that's brilliant. Because I think that sums up the journey that most of us go through, that when we first get into this work of charity, it's all about doing good things. But until that charity evolves into the idea that we're solving real problems in long-term sustainable ways, we have not leaned into the Hebrew notion of Sadaqa. And this is not a new idea. Our God baked it in from the very beginning that we ought to be people who understand the nuances of charity that begin in Hesed, but the problems are solved in Sadaqa along the way. Maimonides, in the 12th century, a revered Jewish rabbi, created 8 levels of tzedakah. And to this day, he is quoted and thought of as a leading, a thought leader among the Jewish people in this whole idea. And he said, the highest form of tzedakah is to give a gift, a loan, or a partnership that will result in the recipient becoming self-sufficient instead of living upon others. That's what we're talking about here. In fact, as you follow the remainder of the story, you find Boaz stepping into the challenges inherent in the very idea of tzedakah. Throughout the chapter 3, you find him addressing Ruth and protecting her dignity as he confronts his own workers and provides for her the work that she needs to be able to provide for Naomi. You see him protecting her dignity. You see him protecting her safety. And in chapter 4, he makes the ultimate commitment through the fulfillment and requirements of the kinsman redeemer. And this did not just simply ease her pain, it changed the very nature of her existence, which is a fundamental difference between Hesed and Sadaqa. Hesed does not change the fundamental difference of a person's position. So when Ruth said, I'm going to go back with you, Naomi, to your land, that did not change her circumstances. If anything, it made Naomi's circumstances even more difficult because now she was going to have to find a way to provide for 2 people. But it was an act of kindness nonetheless. In Sadaqa leads to changing the fundamental existence of the person that you're working with. And it's always more complicated. It's always more costly. And it always takes longer than we thought. And if you run through and just think for a moment about the whole concept of the kinsman redeemer, it is Sadaqa on steroids. The kinsman redeemer, the next in line to take that Jewish woman, changes her entire existence. And so when Boaz realized the situation and Ruth came to him and Naomi wanted to sell the land, she knew that Boaz would go about the more complicated work of the kinsman redeemer. Because you see, Boaz was not the next in line, he was the next to the next in line. And so for him to be able to do this was going to take a little bit more time. Now, all he wanted to do was help out Ruth a little bit. But you realize what's going to happen in the whole kinsman redeemer? To help out Ruth a little bit, he's going to end up buying the land, marrying her, and getting a mother-in-law. All in one fell swoop. And I'm guessing he could have said, look, I didn't sign up for this. As a matter of fact, the next in line, that's exactly what he said when given the opportunity to exercise his right as the kinsman redeemer. When Boaz said, look, if you're going to do this, if you're going to purchase Elimelech's land, it comes with a few extra things. And he said, no, I wasn't planning on that. So you go ahead and do it. And so Boaz does. And that act fundamentally changes the existence of 2 people. What's my point? We all have the ability to exercise chesed at the individual level. Do it. Do it. Every chance you get, practice chesed. But never mistake the notion that chesed will ever change the fundamental existence of others. Some, like Boaz, have the individual power and influence to do tzedakah. Some of you in this room have that. But even if you don't, the church collectively has the power to exercise tzedakah. And I would say this is charity at its best. This is what Boaz can teach us as the church. And for churches willing to step into the challenge, to take on the complications of tzedakah, it represents a rare opportunity for pastors and their churches to position the U.S. church as a powerful force in anti-poverty endeavors. Let's do it.